Okay. Oh, look at us. Thomas Dimitroff just getting back from the Atlanta office right on time, maybe a little bit late.
A little late.
But we're here. SumerSports show, free agency edition. Thomas, how does it feel to be on this Sumer side? I know you were on the Wharton Moneyball podcast. My friend Adi Weiner said that my new assignment is to learn how to measure passion and heart. That's my new one. So how are you doing, man?
I'm good. It was one of those days, just one thing after another. Sumer North, we're really busy here today. Of course, you all are coming in tomorrow, right? We have our group of data scientists, our lead group of data scientists coming in tomorrow. Short of a couple people, of course. I don't think Sean Clement is coming in, is he?
I think Sean is coming, actually. I think he's actually staying longer than I am as well, because he lives more south than I do. But yeah, I'm boarding the 6 a.m. flight tomorrow. I'm going to see if I can get a cheap upgrade to first class, as I always want to do at that hour. But right now, I'm excited to get going, and I'm excited to talk free agency, right? Like we were on the show last night. We talked about mostly the Panthers and Bears. It got to quarterback discussion. People were extremely happy with what we had. And now we're going to get to kind of what's happened in free agency, Thomas, where we've seen, Jalen Ramsey's traded this weekend. We've seen a few other moves, like, for example, Kirk Cousins. Kwesi Adofo-Mensah says, we've ripped the Band-Aid off a little bit with some of these cuts and everything, but we're gonna put 2 more void years on Kirk Cousins' deal. We're gonna spread out his money a little bit, keep Kirk alive. Javon Hargrave goes from the Philadelphia Eagles to the San Francisco 49ers. Caleb McGarry back to the Falcons as well. So both of the linemen, Lindstrom gets an all-time record deal for a guard. McGarry goes back to the Falcons, 2 guys you drafted in the first round. And then, more moves for the Falcons. Jesse Bates, one of the best safeties in all of football. He goes to Atlanta. And Jamel Dean stays in the NFC South, signing a $13 million per year deal back with Tampa Bay, a real big surprise. Jawan Taylor, another surprise there. He goes to Kansas City for a $20 million per year deal. They are moving him from right tackle to left tackle. So there's so much to dive into here. And probably just start with what interests us the most. And for me, I really like, I kind of want to talk about this Javon Hargrave deal, right? So Hargrave goes to San Francisco, big deal. I tweeted this out. I think deals like that are oftentimes making up for draft picks that didn't work, right? So 3 years ago, 2020, right before the pandemic, the Niners traded DeForest Buckner to the Colts, to your guy, Chris Ballard. They give up the 13th overall pick. Buckner gets a big deal. They decide to use that pick on Javon Kinlaw, who's been, less than stellar. Turn the clock forward. They got to reinvest in that position in Javon Hargrave.
So, look, Hargrave, they know what they want there. Let's call it the way it is. John Lynch is a defensive guru through and through, right? As a player, Hall of Famer, he's going to look at that and he's going to say, look, I hear you, head coach. I understand your background is sitting in the meeting rooms with your dad, building the most amazing offenses around there. But we need to keep building this defense. We need. And right now, who do they have there? Right now, they have Hargrove, Eric Armstead, right?
Yeah.
And
Nick Bosa.
That's a stellar group to get rocking with, right? I'm excited for them to continue to build it. San Francisco, as I watch offensively, I watch defensively. I love the city, by the way. It's one of my favorite cities in the country for sure. And look, I'm excited for them to take another shot at it. Look, I have a great deal of respect for, I'm sorry, the head coach, he was with us. He was our coordinator. When I think about how we did things back, how many years ago was it? In 16?
7 years ago now.
That was a tough loss. Kyle Shanahan, I've said this before, I think he's one of the very best in the league. I think he's tradable, meaning, and San Francisco probably doesn't want to hear me, but I think he's one of the few coaches in the league that if I were to be a GM, I would trade for. Now, go ahead.
Well, and is that because I'm gonna take a step back here. So most of the time, we talked about this yesterday. If you don't have a quarterback, and listen to the podcast yesterday after you're done listening to this live here, we talked about yesterday. If you don't have a quarterback, you really don't got a shot, right? And for the most part, that's true. However, I do think that there are some head coaches that can elevate the team so much that you do have a shot even without an elite quarterback. And, you're talking about Andy Reid, you're talking about Sean Payton, you're talking about Kyle Shanahan. As a general manager, when you think about being able to execute offense effectively with the likes of Jimmy Garoppolo, with the likes of Trey Lance, with the likes of Brock Purdy, even back, Matt Ryan's a Hall of Fame quarterback, but he took Matt from like an 8 to a 10 that year, right? Like, if you're a general manager, you're thinking, okay, I want to build the rest of this team. I want toys. I want a defense. I want to buy into draft picks and players on the defensive side of the ball. You said this yourself. You wanted to build a great defense in Atlanta, but there were limitations to what you could do. If you take that 40, 50 million out of the quarterback ledger because you're able to get by with rookie deal guys and cheap guys, Sam Darnold signed for like less than 5 million yesterday with the Niners. Does that obviously, as a general manager, that makes your life easier? And I want to throw a theory out to you, okay? Because the reason trading draft picks for veterans is tough is because you got to pay that guy against the cap, right? So when the Broncos traded for Russell Wilson, they also had to put his dollar figure on the cap. If you trade for a head coach, you can use the Waltons money, you can use the Teppers money, you can use the Paul Tudor Jones money to buy a head coach, and it doesn't count against the cap. And if you do that, you get all of the money to spend on the Eric Armsteads, the Javon Kinlaws, the Nick Bosas, the Charvarius Wards, the Fred Warners, all the guys that can make a great defense. That, to me, is the only other way to win in the NFL.
Well, this is a really cool twist that we're taking here because we're talking about building the team. We're talking about free agency. Tomorrow, we're going to be smack dab in the middle of it.
Right.
We say we're only going 2 hours. Maybe we go longer. Who knows? You may just let the wind take you in Atlanta. We're going to be in our new studio there, and we're going to roll with it. But to this point, when you were putting together the team and you're building the team as co-team builders, head coach and general manager, you think about everything under the umbrella, basically, right? You're thinking about free agency, how you're going to get creative. You're thinking about the money you're putting in there. You're thinking about the draft, which is a month and a half away, and you're thinking about what is better. Do you make the move in free agency, or do you wait in the draft and hope that it comes along? Remember, everyone, there's precariousness in the draft that, quite honestly, there's not in free agency. Although I would 100% say, as I feel like we did often, we were particular about our free agents, proper about how we did it, and then we made sure that we were building as much as possible through the draft. And then you start thinking about this coaching situation, right? You start thinking about making sure you have the right coaches together. Not only a head coach, which is a huge one, of course, but how you're going to deal with your coordinators and how you're going to deal with your position coaches and how they are going to deal with the new players that you bring on, whether they're free agents or whether they're draft picks. So you're always on the edge of your seat as a general manager, thinking about all of these elements, even if you're not the head coach and you're letting the head coach make his call on changes on the coaching staff. Man, you're overseeing that, and you have to be the sobering voice for that head coach at times. So what I'm saying in the end, this is such an exciting time. Look, I would say this for most general managers. Yeah, they like watching their games and they like walking out on the field before games. There is nothing like this time of year. It is a complete buzz. Oftentimes we think after this time we kick our legs up during the season and watch our team play.
Well, and that's also why, football has become, think about this for a second. I'm just going to back up and talk about the industry in general, but it's why football has become so popular is partially because we've gamified it, right? So you think about it, you can read the Wall Street Journal article. One of the reasons SumerSports exists is because Paul and Jack wanted to play fantasy football better. You get that. And for anybody who's listening, who has sports bet or who's played DFS or who's played fantasy, that little that urge, that competitive fire that you get in a fantasy draft, imagine that times 100 times 1,000, you're dealing with Arthur Blank's money, and it's in the millions and not just your $100 buy-in. That I can't imagine how exhilarating that is, and it's why the game has become so popular, and one of the reasons why SumerSports has so much promise, because what we're trying to do is make people better, of course, at this process in many different levels, and then of course the process will change, and then we evolve with it, and it'll create a lot of opportunities for people. The one thing that I wanted to bring up, because I think this is getting to a little bit of what you're saying with being particular, because you said something interesting. You said free agency, you don't have the precariousness that you do in the draft, but it comes at a cost, of course, right? Because when you look at the positions that have been signed this time in free agency, we went an entire day, Thomas. Yesterday happened, and not a single wide receiver was signed. And there was one starting quarterback that signed, that was Jimmy G, but he signed for a mid-tier deal. Not a single like elite corner was signed until the very end, where Jamel Dean went back to Tampa Bay. The thing about free agency is what you saw yesterday were linebackers, defensive tackles, right tackles, tight ends. You saw movement in the non-premium positions, because those are the positions that are available this time of year. If you want to get an elite left tackle, you got to get him in the draft, or you got to trade for him. If you want to get an elite quarterback, you got to trade for him. You got to get him in the draft. Same thing a little bit with wide receiver, corner. They're a little weird, right? Because those are like positions that employ 3-4 guys in the starting lineup. Safeties, those guys are. So when you look at the big time free agent signings, you're looking at Javon Hargrave. You're looking at Jesse Bates, right? Jesse Bates is a top 5 safety in the league. There isn't a Jesse Bates of left tackles that's available right now. There isn't a Jesse Bates of quarterbacks that's available right now. Tremaine Edmonds gets $18 million APY from the Bears. As we talked about when we did all the Bears shows, Thomas, you're not getting the Tremaine Edmonds of left tackles in free agency. You're not getting the Tremaine Edmonds of that's you got to trade for DJ Moore. You can't sign DJ Moore because those guys aren't available this time of year. Can you talk a little bit about why that's so hard? Because even the teams that have cap space right now, they don't get to fill the roster completely during this time, because some positions are not accessible to them through this process.
Can I just backtrack a minute here, because you made a very good point, and I want to make sure that I'm clear with everyone. There is definitely precariousness in free agency. As a head coach and a general manager, when you sit back and you start game planning on bringing a free agent in, or signing your own guy to another contract, you want to talk about uncertainty. The uncertainty is Vic Beasley ready to take it to the next step? Or, and do we sign him to the 5th year? I mean, we did that. We got skewered for that. You don't know. So there's definitely uncertainty there. You don't know how money is going to affect. A lot of these guys have that final push before they go to free agency, and they do really well. And they get that bump up, right? There's something natural about that. And then they come to the other side, they settle in. And many times, or I don't know if it's many times, but a good deal of the time, they're not working out exactly how it was planned, right? That's a tough situation. When I was talking about the precariousness of the draft, I'm more talking about the precariousness of the draft if someone's going to work out, but also you're sitting there expecting a left tackle, and all of a sudden your pick is at 20 and there's a run on tackles. There's nothing you can do. You can't get into a negotiating bid and use all of Arthur Blank's money. You have to chew on your fingernails, pray that someone else is going to come to the forefront. So it's a really interesting thing. Back to the positions that in free agency that might be available and might not be available. I mean, look, let's call it the way it is. On those positions that you mentioned that aren't always there, the left tackles, some of the receivers, the corners, man, let's call it the way it is. Usually the reason that those guys get out from a team is there is some semblance of an issue, at least an issue that hometown team sees. They know the warts, and they're over them, or every once in a while it's a crazy inflammation of salary that they're asking for that people just can't see it. So there's something usually off. Otherwise, you're retaining, right? You are retaining your good ones, especially in the positions that you're talking about.
Yeah, because that's the one where, those premium positions, there's just scarcity there. Like, it's just left tackles don't grow on trees, and quarterbacks certainly don't. And that's why, 5 minutes ago, we talked about why it's so nice to have a coach that elevates the quarterback, because there's obviously benefits there. Quarterbacks, will elevate those around them. And that, can really help, but it's just hard. And that's why the draft matters so much. That's why taking swings at the draft matters so much. That's also why drafting premium positions in those top picks matters so much, because you're not going to access them anywhere else. And again, it opens up a can of worms when, you end up kind of on the wrong side of the cap, per se, and you have to use draft picks to fill needs at non-premium positions, because again, like that, there's just, again, you just want to make sure that your books are balanced. And again, that's what we're trying to do here at SumerSports to help teams. I do want to get to this idea. Now, we published an article on SumerSports.com today about restructures. Obviously we have such great people in our building. Scott Nessler, Chase Falvine, Chris Long have all been working with me on salary cap stuff. Very nice, very, very fun to work with. But we talk about restructures because, the difficulty of restructures is you can always maneuver the cap to make any move work for the most part. The Saints have kind of pushed that boundary a little bit, but for the most part, you can always move the cap, but it comes at a cost. And that cost is almost always that you have to retain a player that is over the hill athletically, or you have to cut a player and pay him to not be on your team. And the sort of biggest one that we saw today was the Vikings with Kwesi Adofo-Mensah restructuring Kirk Cousins' deal again. So just a little bit of background material. The Vikings starting quarterback, he had a $10 million base salary this year. He had some prorated salary or some prorated bonus still left over from his previous deal. And he had a $20 million roster bonus. Roster bonuses are really nice because when you're in a good cap situation, you can just pay it out. And when you're not in as good of a cap situation, you can convert it to a signing bonus. And then that money will be what's called prorated, which is split as many more years as you have left. And so then you essentially push the cap down the road. And as the cap goes up, that cost declines, but it's got to decline more fast than your players decline. So that's really where you get into a hard situation.
So I want to throw it back to you, but what was also really important for everyone to know is every year we came around to the restructures that we looked at, and I hope you didn't mention this and I'm not repeating, but we would sit down, myself, Chase Falvine, Nick Polk, our head coach, obviously at the time, Dan Quinn, and we would decide on who we would restructure. You're only, of course, going to restructure the people that are planning on being there, right? That's a big thing. You're not just taking any big money guy and restructuring, right? You have to be smart about the people that you're using. So that's part of the creativity. I want to also say, and then I'll toss it back to you, I want to shout out a good friend of mine who does a great job in the podcast, The Business of Sport, Andrew Brandt. I want you all to listen to his pod. Boy, he ripped on the people who are suggesting paying quarterbacks high outside of the rookie contract. He just goes on. I would love to hear your response to his take. His point in the end is it's all about cap management. And any of you that are flying off the handle about, these when you have a veteran quarterback and you pay them well, you shouldn't, you'll have a hard time paying the rest of your team. His point is 25 to 30 of the contracts are rookie contracts anyways. Yeah. Listen to it, everyone, as you as well, Eric. And I'd love to get your take. Maybe we can fit it in a little tomorrow.
Yeah, I think, I listened to it, and obviously I have a ton of respect for him. He's around he built winners. He was around winners. I think that's a huge deal. I think that the hard part is, yes, you can win. I mean, the Chiefs just did it. The Chiefs won a Super Bowl with the quarterback making 17% of and that was the first guy that won a Super Bowl making more than 13% or whatever. Now, when you guys made the Super Bowl in 2016, your quarterback was making above that. And I'm pretty sure the end of that Super Bowl was not because Matt Ryan was making a super big part of your cap, right? Like you certainly showed that you can get on the doorstep there as well. I think that the issue is that if you have a quarterback that makes a lot of money, you have to make tough decisions elsewhere. And what did Kansas City do? They didn't get in a bidding war with themselves over Tyreek Hill. They traded him to the Miami Dolphins, and spread the risk out to 5 additional draft picks.
Yeah.
And you look up in the AFC title game like, wow, they really drafted well. They have 3 rookies playing corners against the Bengals. Well, it's like, well, no, they had 3 draft picks and they used 5 draft picks on defensive backs. And now 3 of them, they're playing the numbers game. 3 of them are playing in the AFC title game. And so I agree with Andrew. I just think the issue, and I think this is where I think most teams effectively say, yeah, we want to have Kirk Cousins on the roster. And look, Kirk Cousins, I think, is a pretty good quarterback. I think the problem is you need so much to help him with that it's just not going to fit under the cap. And so my issue is like, you can pay a quarterback a lot, but you also have to be skimpy elsewhere, or you can skimp at quarterback, and that allows you to pay, do what the Eagles did and pay everybody around you. That's where I get a little bit worried. And now you have these instruments. I want you to kind of tell the listeners about this one, because the Vikings used in the Cousins deal something called a void year. And essentially what a void year is it's a year that the player will not play on the contract, but can be used in proration. So what I mean is when the Vikings convert 20 million, so Kirk has 1 year left on his deal. So in theory, you can't prorate the roster bonus at all, because you don't have years to cut it in half, right? Or cut it in thirds or fourths. They added what are called void years. And void years, they added basically 4 void years from last year onto the deal. And so they can take that 20 million and cut it in fifths. Does that make sense? So that they can do that, but Kirk's never playing on those years. So once Kirk leaves the team, that gets accelerated, and that counts as a dead cap hit once he leaves the team. So essentially, again, you're buying now and paying later, and using this instrument that, it started with the Eagles and now a lot of teams use now to essentially, pay for today, tomorrow.
Do you think it's time right now to talk a little bit about non-utilized and dead money? I mean, you obviously just did. I think you did a really good job articulating that. And that's another tool that we use, right? The creativity side of how we're putting things together. And we can talk ad nauseum about that. But the dead money situation in our league, it's one of the things that we talked to Paul Tudor Jones about, our founder and chairman, right? I mean, as an owner, you don't like to see that. And no one likes to see dead money sitting there while you're moving into the next year. And you start thinking, oh my God, do we have 30, 40, $50 million of dead money? Sometimes, I mean, look what Atlanta, I mean, I have such a soft spot for them. I truly do, but that's a lot of money on the docket last year with Matt Ryan and Julio Jones, right? That's not easy to see. Again, I'm getting off on a tangent here a little bit, but dead money has its place. But it's also one of those things that continue to play on an owner's mind, and they do not want to see it as often, but they understand there's a time and a place.
Yeah, I mean, you look at the Rams, right? Like Les Snead, went all in a few times and bought into veterans and kind of, and I sort of think, it was a little overstated how much that was the plan. I think that they kind of got into it and were like, hey, we're a lot better than we thought we'd be. And they started to pile on, and but they won a Super Bowl, right? So in theory, it's worth it. My issue is, and I think it's similar, when you guys were in Atlanta, you won, you were a winner in 16, right? Like you got to the Super Bowl. And in 2017, in my opinion, you were the best team in the NFC. And then the issue becomes okay, you don't get there in 17. How much do you want to buy into 18, 19, 20? And I think that where I really appreciate the Rams right now is they're saying, look, the party's over. Let's recoup. Let's build this thing again. And here's the thing. And I'm going to write about this at SumerSports, next week, but the path back is not that long. I think a lot of people see, and I mean this just for history's sake, not to rip on the franchises, but they see Detroit being kind of whatever for a long time. They see the Cleveland Browns having no division title since you worked for them. 1989 is the last time Cleveland won a division title. You look at the Raiders, you see these prolonged struggles, and you miss on the Jaguars making it back to the playoffs this year, or Detroit having a winning record. Or you look at Chicago, they literally ripped the Band-Aid off in Ryan Poles' first year and just, for lack of a better word, tanked last year. And now their fan base, we did a lot of shows with them in the Super Bowl. Their fan base is more excited than any fan base right now to have the opportunity to rebuild that roster. Mm-hmm. I think that where people might be frustrated with Minnesota is, they had their chance a few times. 2017, they made the NFC title game. Last year, they won 13 games. And it's like, now you got to cut Allen. That's a $13 million dead cap hit. Whenever Cousins leaves, it's going to be about a $28.5 million dead cap hit. And it's like, the longer you stay at the party, the higher the bill get. I mean, it's like real life. The higher the bill is, the longer you stay at the party. And for some teams, it's like, at least with the Rams and in some ways Tampa Bay, they won their Super Bowls. And now they're saying, guys, the party's over. It's time to kind of let this stuff breathe a little bit. And for other teams, they're like, the Saints, for example, they're prolonging kind of the inevitable a little bit because they don't know when to say when in some ways.
So I would like to talk a little bit. I think we mentioned it in one of the other podcasts. I want your take, and I want to banter a little bit about retention rate, right? For us, retention rate as general managers, again, back to, you're trying to do your part as a general manager, right? You're the one who's ultimately in charge, unless it's Bill Belichick, or I hate to say Pete Carroll, because I really do believe that John Snyder's leading that, even though Pete has final say. Same with Brett Veach. Those head coaches are letting their guys do their stuff. Bill, maybe not as much. My point is, retention rate is a big thing, right? As a general manager, you want to believe you're doing your spot. And when I'm talking about retention rate is, it's the people that you draft, you continue to retain, and hopefully more times than not, you're signing them into new contracts, right? You're not going out there always looking for people in other places. What you really want to do, and I remember being really focused on this years ago, sometimes it's good and sometimes it's not, right? Sometimes you get an organization that just churns out people and they keep moving on. Maybe Bill did more of that than other people, but Bill won many, many, many games, right? People can take have their opinions about different things. One of the things that came up in Michael Lombardi's pod the other day with Femi Abedefe, I think I'm pronouncing his name properly. He had this idea, and I know we're back and forth from free agency, but those really good teams that continue to be in the back half of the draft, right? The rounds, so 20 to 32.
Yep.
Very different than having 2, 3, or 4 years. I mean, how many years were San Francisco in a tough spot? And they were able to acquire early on, and that's what you want, right? That's why it's set up the way it is. Capitalize on it. Now they are a damn good team with a lot of really good talent.
And not only that, but they got 7 compensatory picks. And some of that is, they had underrepresented members of their, end up with head coaching jobs and stuff. So they get but to your point, like they retained a lot of their great talent, but they were also able to let some of their great talent go and that the compensatory pick thing is sort of weird in that it's like it's sort of a regressive tax, right? It's sort of, if you're a good team that drafts and develops, you get more of a bounty. And if you're a team like Jacksonville hasn't had a compensatory pick in like 13 years, so like that's super tough. But I get what you're saying. Like, it's tough, right? Because Belichick earned the right to let players go because they won, right? Like, they won games, and it's sort of like, we'll trade Richard Seymour, we'll trade Chandler Jones, we'll trade Jamie. They trade Jamie Collins in the middle of a Super Bowl season. And he came back, right? Because he's like, yeah, go get your money somewhere else and come back. The water, we'll leave the light on for you, right? Like they did the same thing with Kyle Van Noy. They've done the same thing with Deion Branch. They did, Deion Branch was the Super Bowl MVP, and you were there. They traded him for a first-round pick the next year. Branch comes back after the Randy Moss trade. Like it's you earn the right to do that, and like it was really funny because the teams that do that are the teams with long-standing like longevity, like Howie Roseman and the Eagles and Brett Veach and the Chiefs and like those. How do you gain that ability to have a healthy churn rate or a healthy churn / retention rate when you're starting off as a general manager? How do you earn that? Because it seems like it's sort of more of a survivorship bias than anything.
Well, that's a great point. Yeah, it takes time. It takes good moves. Look back to Bill and back to any of those organizations. Here's another part of the irony, and we'll get to your question too. when you're thriving and you continue to do well, people can take their shots about drafting and acquisitions. But if you're winning, it really doesn't matter. I remember when John Snyder, and I'm really good friends with John, when they made early moves in his GM tenure there, well, it was with your team, right? I mean, when they had the poison pill situation going on there, and I remember they're going to make moves, and people are going to look at those moves and they're going to judge those moves. With the teams that are really, really good football teams, I'm going to bring this back to free agency, move away from draft for a minute. Your people, teams, agents, and free agents out there want to go to teams where they think they have an opportunity to win a Super Bowl, right? I'm talking the really good ones who might have been in some midline teams, but they're like, I'm done with this. I'll go somewhere else. I may even take a little bit of a cut, or I may be a little bit of a wayward soul. That's probably the wrong word or phrase. I may have, I may not have gotten along with some of my ex teams. Let's talk Corey Dillon. I'm going back to New England. Let's talk Randy Moss, where you get a guy like Bill Belichick who's done so many amazing things. Whether people don't like the way he carries on with his interviews or not, that's beside the point. One of the very best ever coaches. He gets those guys there. He gets them in his coffers, and he's like, look, I will make you what he did with Randy Moss and Corey Dillon. Those guys, all they wanted to do was play for
Randy Moss is maybe the most talented player to ever play in the NFL. And the Raiders were willing to trade him to the Patriots for a 4th-round pick. That's how much he quit on the Raiders. So yeah, it makes so much sense. Like you look at Andy Reid, right? Like Andy Reid's been with the Chiefs forever. And then prior to that, he was with the Eagles forever. You don't make it that far. Like, you're CEO Sumer, like you deal with personalities every day, like, and talented people don't come, they don't come out of the box the same. Yeah. Right. So like you look at, Andy Reid had, Frank Clark is a little bit of an interesting dude, Kareem Hunt, and that one didn't work. Right. You look at Tyrann Matthews had his moments, right, of getting kicked off teams and stuff. And, Belichick, we talk about Moss, we talk about Corey Dillon, we talk about Brandon Merriweather, right? We talk about guys like that. And then you talk about Albert Hainsworth. That's one that didn't work, right? But he's at least willing to – and whenever anybody looks back at that team, or Chad Ochocinco played for the Patriots, people forget that. He played in the Super Bowl. And you're like, they write off the ones that don't work because they know that culture has that reputation. If a player goes to that culture and it doesn't work, it's the player's fault, right? Whereas if a lot of players go to places that haven't had as much success and like, oh, that's the culture's problem. That's another, unsuccessful coach, yada, yada, yada. And again, it's so hard because I come back to, we look at these teams that have new regimes, right? Carolina with Monty, Tennessee with Rand Carthon, or you look at teams with new coaches or maybe kind of like newish. I still think of like the Panthers regime as being kind of new, right? With Reich and Fitterer and guys like that. You look at those places that are trying to establish a culture, trying to establish winning, trying to establish all of the bounties that end up establishing the winning cultures that end up being the snowball effect. Like, how do you do that? Because it's so hard, right? It's so hard to build that winning culture and to be there for the long haul.
No question about it. Hold that thought or continue to talk. I need to put lights on it here.
Yeah,
I realize
you're dark. Your room's getting dark. Okay, we'll let Thomas get up and turn the lights on a little bit here while we take. Obviously, while Thomas is up, we want to thank you all for joining this special Tuesday edition of the SumerSports Show, the free agency show. There have been some questions that's interesting. Doug Analytics said, will you be live streamed tomorrow? Yes, we will be live streaming tomorrow from Atlanta, should everything work out. I think that, here we have another question here, which I actually want Thomas to talk about this because we've talked about evaluation before. Can't wait from Matt Ungashik, who says, can't wait to hear Eric and Thomas's breakdown of why moving right tackle, left tackle is difficult, and also what traits you're looking for as to why that can happen. Just a lot of other really good questions. Doug, I think did outline this. It's just like so much for daylight savings. That one stuck up on me. That was one I normally know pretty well, but yeah, I have yet to change the clock in my car. I do want to talk about that one for a second, just as we sort of, again, because this is another one where Kansas City just coming off of a Super Bowl, great culture, great team. And they let Orlando Brown walk, right? A left tackle that was a right tackle in Baltimore, one of the worst athleticism scores I've ever seen, but had success there after they traded a first-round pick for him. He asked for too much money last year. They let him play on the tag. They let him go. He's still unsigned. They go and get Jawan Taylor, who's been a guy who's kind of struggled. Had a better year last year than normal, but has always played right tackle in the pros and for the most part in college at Florida. And yet the Chiefs back up the truck and give him $20 million APY over 4 years and are going to move him, reports say, to left tackle. And I don't think that they're getting any criticism. And I don't think they're getting any criticism because we give front offices like that the benefit of the doubt, Thomas. But what goes into a decision to look at a guy who's only played right tackle in the NFL and not necessarily well, but still 25 years old, and we're going to move him to left tackle, protecting the only $500 million asset in the NFL, Patrick Mahomes?
Wow, what goes into it? A lot goes into it. I mean, it's obviously not just Brett Veach and it's Andy and Brett, but it's really honing in on your offensive line coach, doing the studies that we need to do, right? Really breaking down the video to make sure that we know and have some insight, because that is, it's a projection. Did he play in college? I can't remember. Did he play left in college?
No, he played right for the most part. He played right in college.
Okay.
I think that, so it's absolutely an Andy Heck sort of projection. And look, and this is another thing, like, you didn't do this, which is kind of weird. Like, usually when you fire a head coach, right? I think about Brad Childress to Leslie Frazier. I think about, Romeo Crennel to Andy Reid. I think about you generally speaking go for the complete opposite, right? When you hire the next coach. You were interesting because Smith and Dan Quinn seem similar. So maybe you're just more progressive than everybody else is, and you avoid some of these psychological twitches. But it looks like the Chiefs did that exact same thing at left tackle, which was you have kind of a slow, unathletic guy who kind of wins with technique, kind of a clown in a lot of ways, Orlando Brown. And you go with a young, super athletic guy to replace him. That feels like they just looked at Orlando Brown and said, we can win with him, but we need we can shoot for the moon here. And as Paul Tudor Jones would say, we can buy the tail with Jawan Taylor, because if Jawan Taylor ends up being a great left tackle, $20 million a year is chump change. And I think that's what they're doing here.
Yeah. And like you said earlier, that organization knows how they want to put their organization together. They talk about it at so many levels, Brett and Andy, of course. And I will say, when you have someone like that, again, your guys inside out, right? They were agitated last year, of course, because they didn't get it done right. They know his limitations, and they probably figured, look, we won, and did what we did as we did with someone who had limitations. So I think you project a little bit and you're thinking, look, we can only do that much better with this replacement, even though we're still projecting there. And we did what we did as we did and paid. What was the salary on him? I can't even remember what it came out to last year.
Yeah, Orlando was on his rookie deal in 2021, and then last year on the tag he was at $16 million. And reports are that he wanted about $22 million APY to be the left tackle last year. Come back, and again, he had an agent who had never been an agent in the NFL. Kind of the same talk about Lamar, and they kind of, the Chiefs were willing. I mean, it's interesting because everybody. And you can maybe speak to this as a general manager, but everybody talking about, the Chiefs were a hard ass about Orlando Brown. They were a hard ass about Tyreek Hill. In reality, they were willing to retain those players. It's just the price got away from them in both cases. It's really interesting if the public got the data on what was offered, trades too, what's offered behind the scenes, we get a clearer picture of what market value is. We only see what ends up being the strike price, but it's kind of crazy because I think Orlando Brown's in Kansas City if he takes a reasonable deal last year.
Yeah, that whole back and forth reasonable deal, what we deem as reasonable as head coach and GM, and what the player and the agent do. I will say it's funny. We used to call it, we had two different definitions of this, and this doesn't sound really academic, so I'm sorry, but we had puke points for these guys where we're like, no, I will literally throw up if we have to pay this player who we know inside out 22 million versus 16. It will kill us. We're not doing it. And it's usually, it comes down to the head coach and the GM, of course. It also comes down to an owner coming down to, the GM and the head coach and saying, look, how high would you guys go? Where's your break point on this? And you draw a line in the proverbial sand inside your offices. So that happened to us many, many times, both with Mike Smith and Dan Quinn. You don't share it publicly, of course, but believe me, there is a point where you're like, no way, I will not do it. I will walk home 70 miles every day for the next week if I have to do something like that.
So, well, and this is why an agent is so important, right? Because you want to be able to tell the agent, like, look, man, he's not getting 23 million. You don't want to look Orlando Brown in his face, a guy that might end up playing. Again, these are human dynamics. I think what people appreciated so much about the show yesterday, which again, once you're finished with this live broadcast, go back and listen to our podcast from yesterday where we talk about quarterbacks. We talk about the human element of quarterback play and everything. The thing that goes unannounced is like in negotiations, when you're dealing with other people's money and you're dealing with real dollars and you're dealing with millions of dollars and you're sometimes $5 million apart, you're going to have to look the player in the eye if he doesn't have an agent and say, look, I don't think you're worth this. And that's hard to come back from. But if he has an agent, you can say, look, buddy, like, come on, like we did this before with this other player and here's where we met. Let's meet there again. And that's why having an agent who has a clue obviously matters so much, and why, somebody like Jawan Taylor's ending up with the $20 million deal that Orlando Brown didn't end up with because, the agent had a really, had a rough go of it last summer. I think that, when we think about moving forward here, we see the first splash of free agency, right? We see all these guys that we talk about, again, Deron Payne signing back with Washington. We see, the Kirk Cousins deal. We see Javon Hargrave, Jesse Bates, all this, Tremaine Edmonds, TJ Edwards, all these players that we talk about. And we love this, right? SumerSports is going to make SumerSports, however well we do is going to be based upon the popularity of this league. So I'm not spitting in that face at all, right? We love this time of year, but we know that this time of year is mostly for show, right? In a month and a half, that's where you putt for dough, right? That's the draft, right? So when we think about free agency and we think about, tempering expectations, can you give me a little bit of an idea of like, okay, this time of year, what do you expect when you come out of free agency? Are you expecting these guys to be impact players, or are you expecting the free agents that you get this time of year to kind of plug holes and make you more resilient versus make you a Super Bowl contender?
I've mentioned this a number of times. I want them to plug holes, and they all have their varying degrees of how big their hole is and what we're expecting. So there may be, I usually like to come out with one or two starters is what I truly liked, depending on the position. And I also love to be able to feel like we filled some of the backup positions with veteran talent. And again, remember everyone, when you're looking for some of these free agents, a lot of times you are going to your coaching staff and you're asking that coach who's, a defensive coordinator or position coach, hey, do you like this linebacker that you coached at the last team you were with? I mean, look what Atlanta did. Onyemata, right?
Yeah.
And who else did they bring over from their new coordinator, Ryan Nielsen, right? Comes over. There's a comfort level there on some of these replacement guys in free agency, especially, right? You're going to have to be projecting on the draft side, so you better get your group together as much as possible, in my mind, with a number of guys that your coaches have been with. So that is an important thing for me.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's such a good important point where, like, as you're trying to understand, we talked about this yesterday a little bit on the pod, but you look at fit, right? Like because in this round, one of our founders, Jack Jones, he texts me, he's a Giants fan. He goes, what about Bobby Okereke? And I'm like, well, Bobby Okereke is worth about $8.5 million. He's like, oh, so 10 million's a, 10 million. It's like, yeah, you're overspending by 1.5 million. You're overspending by 1.5 million because you know almost exactly what Bobby Okereke is as a player. The linebacker used to be for the Colts, now for the Giants.
Yeah.
Like this time of year, you're overspending for basically every player, right? But if you have a coach that knows how to enhance that player's ability, then that's where you can kind of eat into that deficit. And actually, so again, with Juwan Taylor hasn't been a $20 million player to this point in his career. There's no doubt. I can go back and ask Paul Saban to create plus minus and maybe plus minus. And there's no way Juwan Taylor's worth 20 million up until this point in his career on the field. But you think about Andy Heck, you think about the traits, you think about all those things. That's where maybe you can eat into that deficit. And knowing the coach, the player, how they mesh together, I think is how you can come out of here with some value as well. To your point.
Another interesting nuance is, and it's rarely talked about. You start talking about the sign, you're signing your guys back, right? There's a lot of nuance to that as well, right? The comfort with your veteran players, back to what I talked about, the retention rate. You might have someone in the building who is a big fan who continues to push that guy to stay with the team. That could be the coach, that could be the head coach, coordinator. It could be your general manager who has a real affection towards someone that they want to keep for a reason or not. Here's one. It can also, make no mistake about this, be your owner. And that is a really interesting thought that a lot of people don't believe, or they're like, seriously, there's no way that, of course it would. The owners at times can develop their relationship with these guys, and these guys have been great for the community. They've been great for the marketing side of it. Also could be great to the owner's kids. You never know. I know that sounds, there's elements of that. So instead of going out and pulling someone in that we don't know, if there's someone equal, and even if you deem as an organization you need to pay an extra million, you might do that to the people that have been true to the organization. It sounds odd sometimes, like this is all about winning. But again, there are elements to it that come out, and it's amazing when you really look at the levels.
Well, culture factors in, right? I mean, we were talking, when we were at Sloan, we did this really cool like mentoring lunch, and I was at a table with somebody who worked for the Phoenix Suns, and like obviously they had just traded for Kevin Durant, right? And they had to trade like one of their like great locker room guys. And somebody at the table, really good question, was like, well, how do you factor in that like you're trading somebody that everybody in the locker room looks up to and all this kind of stuff? And to your point, like the owner's kids could like them, right? Or whatever. Like all these questions could happen. And that's like a non-trivial part of this whole thing. Now, Kevin Durant's such a good basketball player, you might be able to like kind of paper over it. But if you're thinking about, why this guy is on the roster only to run down on punts and block on kickoff returns, and he's been on that roster for 5-6 years, there's probably a reason for that, right? And there's probably some cultural aspect to it that makes that player more valuable than they might be on our ledger in our plus minus or our war or whatever. And that's not something not to dismiss. And frankly, like there was always that bit about like Orlando Brown being a groomsman in Patrick Mahomes' wedding. It's like, if they're boys and that's your best player, then making him happy is part of the deal, right? It's part of the deal, and making the owner happy is part of the deal as well. And so, I think be foolish to dismiss those things. Okay. A couple players left in free agency. Levante David, a Tampa Bay linebacker, very well, having played in the NFC South for all those years. I think that he's going to make a team, much like Bobby Wagner last year with the Rams. I think he's going to make a team incredibly happy. He's a linebacker. Then when you look at, he used to be a guy, when we looked at the tracking data, he used to bite on play action a lot, used to be a really flow to the run guy. And then you look at the tracking data, he like learned how to not bite on play action. Like he's getting better as he gets older. I think that at positions like middle linebacker, some guys can age a little bit better. Do you think that, the market for him, what was it like to play against him? And do you think that, wherever he goes for the next few years, he's going to be a surplus.
So to play against him, I mean, he was the guy that we were on our heels with, because given his movement ability and everything that he brought to the table as far as his awareness and just pure football ability, those were tough, just like Bobby Wagner was, right? I mean, those guys were tough to play against. And they, even though they aged from year to year, to your point, they became smarter and even more aware. And look, Bill Belichick, I keep bringing him up, but he was very good with finding those kind of players like that might have been a half a step slow because for a number of reasons and age, but capitalized on the true intelligence of these players and the natural ability. So
Roman Pfeiffer being like the classic one in the early 2000s, to your point, Ted Johnson, Ted Bruschi, all those guys, like much, much more intelligent than they were athletic. But, obviously if you have a great scheme, you can work around it. I want to ask two more questions. One, Orlando Brown, right? You're looking at basically an average left tackle in the NFL who's going to command top end money. He's going to get it somewhere, right? But when you were the general manager of the Falcons, like you built your offensive line through, in most cases, except for center with Alex Mack, you built your offensive line through the draft, right? You Jake Matthews, McGarry, and Lindstrom obviously getting second contracts here. Did it ever cross your mind that this was this is a good option? Like somebody like Orlando Brown, which the league has proven, two teams, he's kind of an average player, but whose market value has been driven up to this $20 million range. I mean, do you see success there for the team that signs him?
No, I do feel like, one man's treasure is another man's whatever it is, or food and poison. Yeah. I hate to call anyone junk. I'm not saying that, but there is something to do with that, right? How certain coaches can handle a player like that, whatever that may be. Yeah, it's complicated because you just never know. And I've said this before, some of the biggest mistakes I made were made on this unbelievably gnawing need. And that could be the case. All of a sudden, look, Tampa Bay cuts their left tackle, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, those are two guys that have played starting football out there. They're obviously, they have their limitations, of course. I think they're both going to surface and they're both going to be starting somewhere. How much they make, though, is going to be a really interesting thing. And who's going to pull the trigger on a big number on it? I don't know. I will say this, I know that in free agency, we always say that it's in the draft. There are always times as a general manager when you very quickly say, oh my God, did we really do this? A lot, you pull the trigger, you get caught up in it all. And then you go out in the spring and you start watching the guy. You watch the player training during the spring training months, and then OTAs start, and you're like holding your head.
You're like, oh,
did we really do this? And of course, you don't share that with the owner at the moment, but you're like, wow, we missed on this guy. That's even before training camp even started. That's not easy.
Okay, this, and I know we have a few minutes left. This gets me back to a question that, like, they asked Robert Smith and Randy. Randy Moss, one of my favorite players of all time. When they're like, how many practices did it take for you to know Randy Moss was a thing? And he goes, oh, it was like 5 minutes into the first practice. How many times, because obviously with draft picks, you see it all the time, and you're an evaluator at heart, but also free agency. Like, has there ever been a player who changed your mind after that? There has to have been, right? Like, but how good is that, like, that initial, oh shit, this guy's slow, or oh wow, this guy's amazing. Like, when, like, how good is that, like, spidey sense at the very beginning when you first see a player on the field live at the for the first time?
So the spidey sense is a great feeling, right? You're like, wow, we got this figured out. But I do want to go back to the reality of this, right? You've invested your owners, you want to talk about a pit in your stomach. You've invested the owner's money. You've made, you've tried not to overextend the expectations, but you also want to market your team a little bit, right? That's not necessarily how Bill does it, in New England, but we always try to be on the positive side of it. And when you start seeing these issues rear its head, man, so yes, spidey sense when it's good, But all of a sudden you're out there and you're like, oh my God, I did not realize this guy's right foot splayed the degree it did. He can't cut off of his right foot. How did we miss that? So it can be something like that. And that becomes a discussion. Before you know it, there's all this discussion. He can't break off his right foot because whatever it may be. So these are, I bring these up. They're funny little stories, but they are pit in your stomach stories because not only have you wasted some money potentially on a signing bonus but you've built it all up, and there may not be an opportunity to satisfy that hole because those other opportunities might be gone.
Right, to right that wrong. I mean, I think when you have a draft situation where the 4th round guy is better than the 2nd round guy, there's some pat on the back too, right? Because the 4th round guy you evaluate is clearly good. And but in free agency, there isn't that backup option, right? Like free agency, you're sort of putting all your eggs theoretically in that one basket. So it can be tough. Although when you draft, I always, we talk about how great the Niners are. And I firmly believe that, but they've also had situations where they draft Elijah Mitchell in round 6, they draft Trey Sermon in round 3, and Elijah Mitchell's twice the player as Trey Sermon. And it just shows the variance that can happen. I'm generally a person who will look at Elijah Mitchell and say, that's a good hit, and just look at Trey Sermon and be like, 3rd round picks bust all the time. But some people will look at it like his egg on their face. It's kind of interesting that way. But in free agency, you don't get the 2 cracks at it. You get one because the money is so substantial. Speaking of substantial money, we'll end on this 2-hour show tomorrow, by the way. Hit the like button. Subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes, on Spotify, wherever you get your podcast. Really appreciate you guys showing up for night 2 of 3 of the SumerSports show this week. Aaron Rodgers. We talked about it being a little extra yesterday, right? Do you take on a guy who's, is a little high maintenance? Now, Aaron Rodgers wants, if I got the count right, Alan Lazard got a 4-year, $44 million deal. He's there. Wants Randall Cobb. Wants Mercedes Lewis. By the way, Mercedes Lewis is so old that when I was a college tight end, I was emulating Mercedes Lewis.
And that's because he was a 4, but you were a 4.6. I think he was a 4.85, wasn't he?
He was a 4.8 flat guy, but I was but he was also 6'6", 260. I was more I was trying to be like a cross between Heath Miller and Mercedes Lewis. I was much more of a Heath Miller, I felt like, than a Mercedes Lewis. But those were the 1st round tight ends back then who were good. Can it work? Because I worry about this, right? I worry about a quarterback who's like, guys, I'm going to join the Jets. It's like that girl, you was like, sure, I'll, but I need these X, Y, it's like, we're already off to a bad start here, right? I fear for the Jets here. I really do, because I think Aaron Rodgers is a wonderful player, but does he really want to play for you if he has this many, sort of requirements right from the jump?
Well, those are complicated decisions to make. And when you're sitting there talking to your owner, again, as head coach and general manager, those are really, really complicated decisions for Robert and Joe Douglas, right? I mean, because, the fallout can be really, really bad for that team. But they're thinking, we're getting one of the best quarterbacks to ever play the game. Yes, he's having some requests, but he hasn't requested on office or 25 parking spots. I'm being facetious.
Yeah.
He's doing what he believes can help this team be a Super Bowl winner. Now, to me, again, I like Aaron. I know there's the people that have their feelings about him. He is playing a little bit of GM, but he believes that he's entitled to that after being through everything he has done. And if he has an audience in a head coach and a general manager who are listening, and both of those guys, as I understand, I definitely know Joe better than I know Robert. Joe's an easygoing guy. He's going to listen to things. He's going to take it all in and measure what might be best for the organization. Just like I mentioned with Tony Gonzalez when we decided not to worry about him not coming back in that final year training camp. It looks good. It can look good. You have a lot of people judging it, Eric. If it goes one way, You look like geniuses. If it goes the other way, everyone will of course say, well, you should have seen that.
Yeah.
So it can be a win or a lose situation. That's not profundity.
Yeah. And the one experience I have growing up in Minnesota was when the Vikings took on, Brett Favre. Like, one of my good friends, Sage Rosenfels, was supposed to be the quarterback that year. And, they went ahead and got Favre. Favre was notoriously a prima donna with the Jets, like having his own locker room and all this stuff. He goes to Minnesota 1 year. You get substantial buy-in, but he did come in after training camp, after Childress had pretended to Tavares Jackson and Sage Rosenfels that they were going to be the guy, right? They get Favre. Favre comes in. They go 12-4. They're one bad Brett Favre pass from playing in a Super Bowl against the Colts. So there was, and he, from all indications, was a stand-up guy. Now, he got injured in that game. The Bounty Gate stuff happened in that game. He was beat to hell, and he didn't want to come back the following year. All this is, written about in Jeff Pearlman's book. And they had to send, I think it was Jared Allen, Steve Hutchinson, and Ryan Longwell down to Hattiesburg to beg him to come back, right? Beg him to come back. They brought him back, goes through the motions, gets Brad Childress fired, right? Like, Brett had 20 interceptions that year. Brad had just gotten a 5-year extension. They fire him 10 games in. It's a disaster. The thing and again, so would you have, if you're a Vikings fan, would you have taken the 12-4 and the almost Super Bowl for the disaster the next year? Yes, you would have. Yeah. If you're Brad Childress, would you have taken it for what ended up being the end of your career as a head coach? I don't know. That's my worry is, again, these things always, Matt, by the way, really appreciating the Tavares Jackson reference. But the thing, that's what I worry about if I'm Salah or I'm Douglas, is that you build this whole team, right? And it's all contingent on getting this guy to play for you and to be a good citizen of the team for any number of years. And that is tough. And I'm with you. I would take that gamble, but you got to know that it's a gamble.
Your guys on the Wharton podcast today, you want to give them shout outs right now because I really enjoyed my time with them today. They had mentioned to me, do you guys sit around as general manager and staff and the head coach, and project the probability of something happening? My response to them was, yes, we do. I wish, as people in the NFL, and maybe it's changing, and I'm hoping it will with, of course, being involved with Sumer, because I want people to understand there's so much more data out there to utilize, and we're not utilizing it, generally speaking. Do you truly project the probability of something going awry if, Aaron Rodgers comes and has all these requests? And how do you do that? Or is it just, if it happens, it happens, we're hoping it doesn't, and that's the way it is? How do you become more exact in any decision you make? And how would you suggest that if you were a assistant general manager, general manager, how would you suggest?
Well, I would say you have to go, and there was a really interesting one team that I'm, with a front office member I'm fairly close with, during the draft, we're like, look, can you tell me the probability this player lands in this spot, right? Because that our whole draft, and they derived it themselves. They just wanted a second opinion, but ultimately they were like, we want to know because our entire draft hinges on this particular outcome. And they want to know what my probability was to see if it was anywhere close to theirs because they were trying to derive it. They're called pre-mortems is what I would call them. So you look and say, okay, here, and in statistical speak, you call it the sample space. You would say, let's enumerate everything in the sample space. So you have Aaron shows up and he's a great citizen and he's an amazing football player. What's the likelihood that happens? And what are the outcomes that could happen there, right? And this is why models are so important. And then you have what happens if Aaron comes, he's a great player, but he's a pain in the ass. Then you enumerate all those. What happens if he comes here and he's garbage and he's a pain in the ass? What happens? And you try to enumerate all those possibilities. And you say, can I live with this? Right? Because if you're the Jets and there's even a 10% chance that and you win a Super Bowl, that's a job for life, right? Think about, you guys, when you were in the Falcons, you had a 13-year career there. That's 4 times the average, right? And all these things, like all this stuff you get to experience in that realm. That's Joe Douglas if they even make the AFC title game or a Super Bowl, right? And if you're saying, okay, that fat tail, I'll buy that, right? If he comes there, and this is my opinion, if he goes there and he's a complete nightmare as a guy, I think the world forgives Joe Douglas, right? Like, because they're like, look, he was a pain in the ass at the end of Green Bay, right? Like, and no one's really going to blame him for trying. That would be so. It's a great question by Cade, Audie, Shane, and Eric of the Wharton Moneyball podcast. Which, after you listen to the SumerSports show, you should certainly listen to. Thomas is going to star on that tomorrow, Wednesday, the 15th of March. But like, I think I don't know if that many teams do these pre-mortems, but I would say that has to be a part of any decision-making process you have. And us at SumerSports are going to make those probabilities more explicit for our clients as we move forward.
Excellent.
Well, awesome. So, yeah, this has been a great show. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you for all that came around. We had, record highs again in people, not only on Twitter, but on YouTube, listening to us. This has been, just a wonderful time. Tomorrow, we're going to go for 2 hours. We're going to start at 4. Technology willing, we're going to go 4. We're going to go Thomas and I from his office. This is the SH991. Eric, you're never tired of talking. That's probably true. That they did put that on my scouting report. So for Thomas Dimitroff, this has been Eric Eager. This has been the SumerSports Free Agency Show.